A happy place. Plot's home for discarded children was not a happy place. Its potato-shaped proprietor, Mrs. Plot, was forever wishing it was. "All I want," she would say to whichever child she was thrashing at that particular moment, "all I want is to find a happy place." Then she would hang the child on a hook by its belt loops and walk away shaking her head. "Do I ask too much?" she asked of the peeling paint corridor. "Do I?" She often let the children dangle all afternoon while she soaked in a hot bath full of camellia petals, sipping a pint of nameless cocktail and reading celebrity gossip magazines. Her favourite star was a brawny actor from Australia called Brett Haddock. Mrs. Plot would stare at pictures of Brett and smile and glug her drink. Sometimes there were so many children hanging from the hooks that Mrs. Plot would run out and have nowhere to hang the next newly thrashed infant. "Where's my happy place?" she would wail at the pendulous youngsters. "Where? Oh, what I wouldn't give for a ticket to Australia. I could be happy in Australia." As dusk sneaked in, the children were unhooked, given a couple of spoonfuls of slop and a reading from whichever newspaper had the most impressive bad child story that day. Then they limped away to the almost comfort of bed. "If only we could find her a happy place," whispered Ray Wheeler. "Then she'd leave us alone. Where is Australia anyway?" "She'll never leave us alone, Ray." Juliet Bell was shaking her head knowingly. "We could hand her a happy place on a plate with bells on. She wouldn't know what it was if it blew her a kiss. She don't know happy, and she don't like people who do. Australia's the other side of the world. You have to go through the earth to get there." "I hate getting hung up," whimpered Benny Brown. "We all do, Benny." Ray rolled across the floorboards to Benny's mat and gave him a pat. "I just don't know how to stop it." "Don't you worry, Benny." Juliet's cracked spectacles glinted in the shadows. "Them Hooks days are numbered." Honestly speaking, Juliet was bluffing a bit. She had no more of an idea of how to escape Mrs. Plot's spite than Ray did. But, unlike Ray, she had conviction. Juliet Bell knew that hanging from a hook was a punishment that no living thing should have to endure. "And punishment for what?" she demanded of the night before sleep took her somewhere less gloomy. "We ain't done nothing." Nor had they. Most of the children at Mrs. Plot's establishment were timid, willing creatures who desperately wanted to please their guardian. "What's this?" Mrs. Plot loomed over Benny Brown the next day, holding a tiny ball of fluff between her putty flesh finger and thumb. Benny had just swept the floor of the kitchen and corridor and was now on his knees giving it a quick scrub with a brush and some soapy water. He had not been told to do this. He had chosen to because he thought it would help Mrs. Plot find her happy place, and if she did, he thought, she would be less inclined to thrash him and hang him from a hook by his belt loops. But she hung him up anyway. "A happy place!" she yelled as she waddled off to answer the doorbell. "Don't I deserve that much?" Rearranging her face so that it resembled a less lumpy potato than usual, she opened the front door. "Another cherub for you, Mrs. Plot." It was Councillor Winkle, his wart-nobbled hand resting firmly on the shoulder of a boy with slanting eyes and lips that Mrs. Plot didn't care for. Defiant lips, that's what they were. "Sit Sidney Blythe, continued the counsellor. As always, I am confident he will blossom under your nurturing wing. Counsellor Winkle was lying. He was not at all confident about Mrs. Plot's nurturing wing, but as he walked away from the gates of the home, he felt the relief of having offloaded another discarded child onto someone else, and knew he could now manage his three-course lunch more comfortably. Sidney Blythe was thrashed and hung on a hook almost immediately. Having waved goodbye to the counsellor, Mrs. Plot had felt the need to mention that, in her mind, Sidney Blythe was a stupid name, and people with stupid names invariably turned out to be nothing but stupid. To which Sidney had responded calmly, "Fat lot you know, potato face." And his career as a dangling youth began forthwith. "What's all this happy place business?" Sidney asked of his housemates that night as they lay on their mats awaiting the relief of sleep. They explained to him that that was all that Mrs. Plot wanted. Sidney stared up at the flowers of damp on the ceiling. "You know," he said after several minutes of quiet contemplation, "if someone needs to find their happy place, it's just rude not to help them get it." Through her damaged specs, Juliet Bell noticed that right then it wasn't only Sidney's eyes that slanted. His lips, cheekbones, even his ears had all slid upwards, so his whole face was grinning. That was what she liked to see. That, Juliet nodded to herself, was conviction. It took a few days to get everything ready. Sidney turned out to be a very enterprising young lad. When they all got hung up the following afternoon, Juliet swung round to see him hacking through his belt loops with a penknife. "How'd you hide that from her?" she asked, agog. "Never you mind," winked Sidney. He cut them all down so they could help him dig. This went on for the next 3 afternoons, but Mrs. Plot was in her bath and the digging was in the cellar where, because of her fear of cobwebs, she never ventured. On the night before, Sidney crept out of the sleeping room with Ray to see to the final details. When they were done, Ray said, "You sure about this, Sidney?" Sidney's face slid upwards. The next morning was one of the worst the children had ever experienced. They had somehow managed to upset Mrs. Plot so much that she stood them in a line and walked along it, hitting each child firmly on the head with a cast iron pot. Then she thrashed them all and hung them on the hooks by their belt loops, which they had always carefully sewn up after Sidney's penknife treatment. "Find a happy place!" she screamed wildly. "All I want to find a happy place! A happy place!" She stormed off, and 5 minutes later the swinging children heard the noise of running bath water. Sidney whipped out his knife. Juliet never did work out where he hid it. Once they'd all plopped onto the floor, he led them to the living room door. No one was ever allowed in the living room. Mrs. Plot said it was too smart for children. She never went in there herself unless Counsellor Winkle stayed for a cup of tea. The living room door was locked day and night. But Sidney, it turned out, was good with locks. They crept in and saw the final details of Sidney's plan. 3 lengths of timber leant from the base of 3 of the living room walls and, like a giant tripod, stretched up to meet in the middle of a bath-shaped outline in the ceiling. Just so you know, Mrs. Plot's bathroom was above the living room. "What's that line up there?" asked Benny Brown. "That's not a line," said Sidney. "That's a cut." Me and Ray made it with a saw." The children looked at the floor, where there was another bath-shaped outline directly beneath the one above their heads. "Don't step inside there," said Sydney sternly. He looked up again. "Shh," he said. "We just have to wait until—" "Now! Do it!" he yelled just at the moment when they all heard the Mrs. Plot getting into bath noise, and he was yelling specifically at Ray and Juliet, who, like he, were each standing next to a length of wood. On Sydney's "Now, do it!" command, they all three of them kicked their wood so hard that it gave way, and the bath-shaped outline in the ceiling fell, and a Mrs. Plot camellia petal and gossip magazine-filled bath flew past them, crashed through the matching bath-shaped shape in the living room floor, and plummeted into the cellar. It didn't stop there. A deep, children-dug pit awaited the arrival of the bath, which banged into the earth with unspeakable force. The children leaned over the hole in the floor in wide-eyed fascination. "She's so fat," explained Sydney, "and that bath's so heavy, and it's full, it'll just keep going." Turning to Juliet, he added, "The pit was just to help things along." He was right. Mrs. Plot's bath didn't stop. It couldn't. It had fallen from such a height and carried so much weight that it bore through the earth at an awesome pace. After a while, the peering children could no longer see it. "Wow," said Ray. "She must be well on her way to Australia." "Too right," said Juliet, and she grinned at Sydney and his plan of conviction. Benny Brown frowned. "Did we do it then?" Sydney's face slid upwards and he nodded. "So she's happy now, Mrs. Plot?" Benny tugged on Juliet's belt loop. Juliet giggled. "Oh yeah, Benny," she said. "Don't you worry. She's in a really happy place."